So Satan comes with a second temptation. Now he does not go to the intellect. Now he comes to the will. He said, look, is it not written in the word somewhere that he will give his angels to protect you, to keep charge over you, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone? All right, Jesus, this is your moment to prove that power. Why don't you jump and see if his angels indeed come to protect you? Fascinating. I think T.S. Eliot remarked about this temptation, that this one may be the greatest treason, to do the right thing for the wrong reason. Why don't you jump and see if his angels will indeed come and protect you? You see, ladies and gentlemen, Satan made a right assumption here. The reason he made the right assumption is he was quoting the scriptures, that God would give the angels charge over his son so that he would not have that hurt to himself. He says, why don't you prove it right now? So Satan's right assumption is that some things can only be explained by God's presence. There is no other explanation for them, the reality of the spiritual and the supernatural. I do an awful lot of dialogues on university campuses. Most of my time is spent dialoguing with those who are hostile to the gospel. So we get to the best of these arenas, and I hear some of the most startling of comments. Earlier on this year, I was doing an open forum at the University of Florida in Gainesville. My colleague and I were there having some tremendous responses. Over 1,600 that second night at Gainesville. It's quite a challenging institution. First night, about 1,400 were there. Press reporters covering to see what would go on in this kind of a defense as I was presenting the defense of the Christian faith. Do you know what the opening student actually said? I think I may have mentioned this to you a week ago. He actually stood up and said he did not even know if he existed. He couldn't be too sure. I asked him if he was sure that I existed. No, came the answer. He was actually standing and asking me that question, but he wasn't even sure of my existence. And I gave him that usual quip, which you're familiar with, I'm sure, which Professor Nathan from the University of New York used when a student paused and asked him, how do I know that I exist? Dr. Nathan lowered his glasses and said, and who shall I say is asking? How do you deny your own existence? But I'll never forget the high point of that whole 2-day episode in standing there and facing all of their questions was to go out with 5 scientists who were professors at that university for dinner, or at least for a bite after the second open forum. And I raised some questions for them, how the scientists explain away certain things. And one of them actually looked across at the table saying he recognized that that was a question that was an immense problem for scientists. He said, but we selectively select the problems we choose to respond to. He was speaking the truth. We selectively select. Think, for example, of how does one explain the origin of the universe? I'm not talking about evolution. Evolution is a process after the origin. I'm talking about the origin of the universe. Why don't we ask questions of the Big Bang that we would ask of any other bang? It's just there. When Bertrand Russell was asked, how do you explain the universe? It's just there. Well, why can't I say that about God? He's just there. That's not satisfactory. The Big Bang can explain its bangingness without any other question thrown. It's a nimbus, it's protection. And I'm making light of it. Let me point out a couple of facts here. Just think about this. My professor at Cambridge, professor of quantum, Dr. John Polkinghorne, was talking to us once in a lecture hall about the impossibility of this universe happening by accident. He's one of the leading quantum physicists in the world. His book, Quantum, was acclaimed by Physics Bulletin as one of the best in its genre. And John Polkinghorne was once lecturing on the first 3 seconds of the existence of the universe, and he made this comment. He said, do you know that the ratio between the expansion and the contraction had to be so precise, so exact, and the margin of error so small that it would be literally like taking aim at a 1 square inch object on the other end of the universe, 20 billion light years away, and hitting it bullseye. He said that. And you can check it out in his book, which is entitled One World. And Polkinghorne made that comment in the lecture room, and then in typical British anticlimactic humor, he had a kind of a sneer on his face, and he said to the class, he said, ladies and gentlemen, there's no free lunch. Somebody has to pay. In other words, you don't get a universe so densely textured and so information-rich by accident. At the Arkansas trial on evolution and creation, Professor Chandra Vikramasinghe, who is from Sri Lanka, teaches applied mathematics at the University of Cardiff in Wales, is a colleague of the famed Professor Hoyle. Dr. Vikramasinghe made this comment. He looked at the judge and he said, let me say something. You know, bear in mind he was a Buddhist, and he is a Buddhist, and Buddhists theoretically are atheists. At least non-theistic, I should say. It's an ethical theory, but there's no positing of an actual personal God in classical Buddhism. So Dr. Vikramasinghe, this was a startling comment that he made. He said, Judge, can I say something to you? He said, when you take the human enzyme and analyze its information factor and its sequence, the possibility of the information for human beings coming together in the right sequence is actually zero. He said, because the possibility is 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. And then he looked at the judge and he said, do you know what 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power is? He said, 10 to the 40,000th power is more than all of the atoms in all of the known galaxies of all of the known universe. That's how much 10 to the 40,000th power is. He says, Judge, the possibility of the enzyme coming in the right sequence, it would take a 1 in 10 to the 40,000th try possibility just to have it come in the order. In other words, he says, Judge, the possibility is zero. That's the enzyme. Then you got to build a gene. And then the cell. Reminds me of Professor David Block, with whom I teamed up at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He's a fine Christian, and Professor Block put on the screen stars on the screen that was taken by a NASA shot, and he said there's 100 billion stars on the screen there. He said if you choose to count them at 1 per second, it'll take you 2,500 years to be here just to count those stars. And the Bible says he made the stars also. You see what I'm saying? There are some things in life that are not naturalistically explainable. You have to explain it only with the presence of God or the supernatural. But Satan is going beyond that. He's not just talking about the grandness of the universe. He's talking about the specific intervention of God in your life and in mine. And let me give to you a simple little story that came in Reader's Digest in 1988. It was called A Boy, a Snake, and an Angel. And in that article, this writer talks about his son, who was 8 years old, somewhere close to that, 8 or 10 years old, who was out playing in the backyard in the woods out in Naples, Florida. And all of a sudden, while he was out there with his dog and just having a great time in the leaves and the rubble on a beautiful fall day, suddenly the massive head of an eastern diamondback rattlesnake sank through the leather of his shoes into his foot, and a searing jolt of furious heat savaged his lower leg. Not long after that, his father was walking through the kitchen and saw his little boy lying there unconscious in the kitchen, and looking at his foot knew what had happened, that the poison of the snake, the venom, was now in his system, and that his boy was probably gone. He put his boy into the car and sped away to the hospital, knowing he wouldn't even have time to call an ambulance. Halfway through on a highway, his car broke down. He was literally standing with his boy, and a Haitian farm worker driving in a broken down pickup, as it were, saw him waving for help, and they put this boy in that pickup, took him over to a clinic, and the clinic doctor said, your boy is too far gone. There's nothing we can do. I don't think there's anything anybody can do, but you'll have to drive on another 10, 15 miles from here to find a doctor who maybe can help, but I doubt it. They drove him over to another hospital, and I think it was after 48 or 72 hours when the little boy regained his consciousness. And the doctor was by his side. They expected it would be around that time that there was going to be any life at all, otherwise he'd be gone. And after he opened his eyes and began to get coherent, the doctor just held the little boy's hand and he said, I want to say something to you, young lad. He said, in all my years of practicing medicine, he said, I have never seen somebody recover with so much of that poison in their system. He said, this is indeed something fascinating. I don't know how it's happened. And this young lad looked at him and said, Doctor, I know how it happened. He said, when I was out in the woods and that snake made its way towards me, sank its fangs in through my shoe, he said, if it were not for the barking of the dog, I would have been finished. But the dog literally got that snake away from him. And he said, I started to hobble over towards the house, and I knew I wasn't going to make it. He said, and then a figure in complete white, out in the woods there, stopped there, picked me up, and held me close to him, and told me, he said, young lad, little boy, he said, you're going to be a very sick boy for some time, but do not be afraid. I'll be with you, and you'll be well again. And as this boy started to unfold the story to the doctor, he began to get very uncomfortable. And the parents began to fidget because the dad writing in Reader's Digest says, we are not religious people. We don't go to church. We have no such upbringing in our home. And the doctor said, well, it's nice to think that that's what happened. Whatever happened, I'm just glad you're well. He said, no, doctor. I do not think it happened. It actually happened. And the father ended the article, no matter how we have tried to convince our boy that maybe it was only a dream he had, we have a young lad growing up believing he was carried in the arms of God. What a marvelous little story. God has intervened. God does intervene. God intervened in my life when I was 17 years old, lying on a bed of suicide in New Delhi. With all hope gone, no purpose left for life, why did God put it into the heart of a man to bring a New Testament by my bed and to tell me of the love of Christ and give to me that Gospel of John pointing to the person of Jesus Christ? And over the years as I've traveled, I have sensed that hand again and again and again. There is no other way to explain some interventions. But what is the point here? The point here is this: Jesus knew that his Father made the promise that angels would keep charge over him. But the point here is a very subtle one. He's asking Jesus to take control and demand when he wanted God to intervene, to make God, as it were, a servant to his desire. Had Jesus given in to the first temptation that Satan placed before him, he would have yielded to the temptation of materialism, that man is primarily matter. Had he yielded to the second one, it would have been to utilitarianism, to use God, the ends justifying the means. He says, no, be gone, Satan. He says, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test.